The night was calm, and the stars shone brightly over the quiet countryside. A light breeze carried the scent of grass and damp earth, but Clara's focus was on the path ahead. Her footsteps echoed softly as she walked toward the graveyard her grandmother had always warned her about. The glow, they said, could be seen from miles away, but Clara hadn't believed it, until tonight. She paused at the rusted gate, staring at the rows of gravestones bathed in moonlight. It was an ordinary cemetery, old and overgrown, yet one grave stood out. From a distance she could see the faint golden glow emanating from it, pulsing softly like a heartbeat. Her pulse quickened as she stepped through the gate, her shoes crunching against the gravel path. She had heard stories about this grave since she was a child, tales of a soldier who had done something extraordinary, though no one ever explained what it was. The village elders called it a curse, but her father had called it a miracle before his death, leaving her with more questions than answers. Clara approached the glowing grave, her shadow stretching long in the dim light. The name etched into the weathered headstone was barely visible, but she knew it by heart. James Marlowe, 1921 to 1944. Her fingers brushed against the stone, cool and rough to the touch. The glow intensified for a moment, as if responding to her presence, and she stumbled back, her heart racing. She crouched down, her curiosity battling with unease. Why was the glow stronger now? What did it mean? She ran her fingers over the ground, the soft dirt cool beneath her palms. That was when she noticed something she hadn't seen before, an inscription near the base of the headstone, hidden under years of moss and grime. She scraped it clean with her nails, her breath catching as the words came into view. They buried more than a man here. Her chest tightened. What did that mean? Was it a warning or a plea? She glanced around, half expecting someone to emerge from the shadows, but the cemetery remained silent, the air heavy with an unspoken tension. A sudden gust of wind made her shiver, and she stood up, brushing the dirt from her hands. Clara reached into her bag and pulled out a flashlight, aiming its beam at the grave. The glow flickered slightly, almost as if it were alive, and she felt a chill crawl up her spine. She crouched again, brushing away more dirt, and her fingers hit something hard, something that didn't belong. It wasn't a rock or a root. It was metal. Her heart pounded as she dug deeper, her flashlight clamped between her teeth. The edges of a small, rusted box came into view. It was buried shallowly, as though someone had left it there in haste. She hesitated, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. This box had been hidden here for a reason, but was it something she wanted to uncover? The glow from the grave pulsed again, brighter this time, almost urgent. Clara swallowed hard, gripping the box tightly as she pulled it free. She wiped the dirt away with her sleeve, revealing strange engravings on its surface. They weren't letters, at least not any she recognized. The symbols seemed to shimmer faintly under the flashlight, as if they held their own kind of energy. Clara glanced back at the glowing grave, her mind racing with questions. Why was this here? What was inside? And why did it feel like someone, or something, was watching her? She turned the box over in her hands, finding a small latch on one side. Her fingers hovered over it, her breath catching. She wasn't sure she wanted to open it, but the glow seemed to demand it, as if the grave itself wouldn't rest until she did. She heard a faint sound behind her, like the soft crunch of footsteps on gravel. Whipping her head around, she scanned the darkness with her flashlight, her heart pounding in her ears. But there was nothing there. Only silence. Clara turned back to the box, her fingers trembling. She had come here for answers, and she wasn't leaving without them. She took a deep breath and opened the latch, the lid creaking slightly as it came free. Inside, she found a small locket and a folded piece of paper yellowed with age. Her hand shook as she reached for the paper, unfolding it carefully. The handwriting was faded but legible. It read, "To those who find this, the truth lies beneath." Clara stared at the note, her hands trembling. The words echoed in her mind, heavy and foreboding. She glanced back at the grave, its glow now steady, almost expectant, as if urging her to dig deeper. The locket in the box caught her attention next. It was small and delicate, the kind of item someone would keep close to their heart. She opened it carefully, revealing a faded photograph of a young woman with soft eyes and a warm smile. There was no name, no inscription, just the image of someone who seemed lost to time. Her thoughts raced. Who was this woman? What connection did she have to James Marlowe? And what truth was buried beneath this grave that demanded to be revealed? Clara folded the note and slipped it into her pocket, her mind already made up. She wasn't leaving until she found out. The night air grew colder as she retrieved a small trowel from her bag. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. She crouched down by the grave, her flashlight balanced on the ground, and began digging. The soil was damp and heavy, clinging to her hands as she worked. The glow of the grave seemed to pulse in rhythm with her digging, a silent encouragement or maybe a warning. Minutes turned into what felt like hours. Her breaths came in shallow gasps, her muscles aching as she dug deeper. Then the trowel hit something solid. Her heart skipped a beat. She cleared away the dirt with her hands, revealing the edge of a wooden plank, its surface weathered and splintered with age. It wasn't a coffin. It was something smaller, almost like a chest. Clara hesitated, her palms resting on the dirt-covered wood. This was it. Whatever lay inside could answer everything or leave her with more questions. She pushed against the lid, and with a groan of protest, it gave way. Inside was another box, this one metal, with the same strange engravings as the one she had found earlier. Next to it lay a journal, its leather cover cracked and worn. She picked up the journal first, her fingers brushing against its fragile pages. The name James Marlowe was scrawled on the first page, written in a hurried, almost desperate hand. She flipped through the pages, scanning the entries. The handwriting grew shakier with each page, the words recounting battles, losses, and something more, something darker. One entry stopped her cold. "I've discovered the truth about the orders. They're abandoning the civilians to save themselves. They called it strategy, but it's murder. If I speak out, they'll silence me. If I don't, I'll never rest. To whoever finds this, please tell my story. They need to know what happened here. They need to know the truth." Clara's chest tightened as she read the words. The glow from the grave seemed to brighten, casting long shadows across the cemetery. Her mind raced. James hadn't just been a soldier. He had been a man caught in a terrible choice. He had tried to save lives and paid the ultimate price for it. But why had the truth been buried with him? Why hadn't anyone spoken up for him all these years? The questions burned in her mind as she turned her attention back to the metal box. She lifted it carefully, her fingers running over the engravings. The symbols shimmered faintly in the flashlight's beam, almost alive. As she opened the box, a wave of cold air swept over her, sending a shiver down her spine. Inside was a folded piece of fabric, an armband with the insignia of his unit, and a series of letters, their edges frayed. The top letter was addressed to "My dearest Evelyn." Clara's breath caught. Evelyn, the woman in the locket. She unfolded the letter, her eyes scanning the faded ink. "Evelyn, if you're reading this, it means I didn't make it back. I'm sorry I couldn't keep my promise to come home, but I had to do what was right. They'll call me a traitor, but you know the truth. Please don't let them forget me. Don't let them bury what really happened. I love you always. James." Tears blurred her vision as she read the words. James hadn't just died in battle. He had been betrayed by those he trusted. His story had been buried. His name tarnished, all to protect the reputations of others. And now, decades later, his grave glowed not as a curse, but as a beacon, demanding justice. Clara sat back, clutching the letter to her chest. The glow from the grave seemed softer now, almost gentle. She knew she couldn't leave this buried. James's story needed to be told, no matter the cost. As she packed the journal and letters into her bag, she felt a renewed determination. This wasn't just about uncovering the past, it was about setting it right. Clara stood by the grave, her heart heavy with the weight of what she had uncovered. The wind had died down, leaving the cemetery eerily silent, as if the world itself was holding its breath. She glanced at the grave one last time, the glow now steady and warm, almost as though it were watching her. The letters, the journal, and the locket felt heavier in her bag than they should have. This wasn't just a discovery, it was a responsibility. As she made her way back to the village, her thoughts raced. James's story wasn't just a tragedy, It was a deliberate injustice. Someone had gone to great lengths to bury the truth with him, to silence the voice of a man who had chosen what was right over what was easy. Clara knew the glow wasn't just a phenomenon, it was a cry for justice, a restless plea for someone to finally uncover what had been hidden for so long. She reached the historian's house just as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon. The small, weathered building looked almost inviting in the soft glow of morning. Clara knocked on the door, her movements hurried and insistent. It took only a moment for Mr. Grayson to answer, his face marked by a night of little sleep. His eyes widened when he saw her, and then they fell to the bag she clutched tightly against her side. "You found something," he said, his voice a mix of surprise and apprehension. Clara stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, placing the bag on the table. "I found everything," she said, pulling out the journal and the letters. Her voice trembled slightly, but her resolve was clear. James wasn't a traitor. He was a hero, and they covered it up. Grayson sat down, his hands trembling as he picked up the journal. He flipped through the pages, his expression growing darker with each entry. This is incredible," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "If this is true, then the entire narrative we've been told about that battle is a lie." "It is true," Clara insisted, pulling out the letter addressed to Evelyn. She unfolded it and placed it in front of him. He wrote this to the woman he loved. He knew what would happen if he defied those orders, but he still did it. He saved lives, and they called him a traitor for it. Grayson read the letter, his brow furrowing. When he finished, he leaned back in his chair, his eyes heavy with thought. "This is going to stir up a lot of trouble," he said finally. "The Hall family won't let this go unchallenged. Their reputation is built on the legacy of that battle. If James's truth comes out, it will destroy them." "Good," Clara snapped, her voice sharper than she intended. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "They destroyed him. They destroyed his name, his life, and his chance at being remembered for who he really was. This isn't about them. It's about him." Grayson nodded slowly, his gaze shifting back to the journal. "If we're going to bring this to light, we'll need to be careful. They have connections, influence, they'll do everything they can to discredit us." "I don't care," Clara said firmly. "This has been buried for too long. It's time for the truth to come out." Grayson hesitated, then gave a slow nod. "We'll start with the local council," he said. "If we can get enough support, we might be able to get James's name reinstated. But it won't be easy." Clara leaned back in her chair, exhaustion washing over her. She glanced out the window, where the sky was now a soft shade of pink. The graveyard felt a world away, but she could still see James's glowing grave in her mind, urging her forward. She wasn't sure how this would end, but one thing was certain. She wasn't going to stop until the truth was told. The council chamber was crowded, the air thick with tension. Clara sat at the front, her hands gripping the edge of the table. In front of her, the journal, letters, and locket were carefully arranged, each item a piece of the story she was about to tell. To her left, Mr. Grayson sat quietly, his presence a reassuring weight. But across the room, Clara could feel the piercing gaze of the Hall family. Their patriarch, William Hall, sat stiffly, his face carved into a mask of disdain. When the council leader called for silence, Clara stood, her knees trembling slightly, but her resolve unshaken. She cleared her throat, her voice steady as she began. "James Marlowe was a soldier who gave his life to save others," she said, her words cutting through the murmurs in the room. "But instead of being honored, he was branded a traitor. His name was erased from history because he refused to follow orders that would have led to the deaths of innocent people." She lifted the journal, holding it up for everyone to see. "This is his story, written in his own words. He defied his superiors to protect the lives of civilians, and for that, they framed him. They called him a deserter, a coward, but this journal proves the truth." The room was silent, save for the soft rustling of papers as council members leaned forward to examine the evidence. Clara could feel the weight of their scrutiny, but she pressed on, pulling out the letter addressed to Evelyn. "This letter was written to the woman James loved," she continued, her voice growing stronger. "In it, he admits he knew what the consequences of his actions would be. He knew he would be silenced, that his name would be dragged through the mud. But he did it anyway, because it was the right thing to do. The council leader gestured for her to hand over the letter. Clara walked to the center of the room, placing it on the table. She glanced at the Hall family as she returned to her seat, catching the slight tightening of William Hall's jaw. It was subtle, but it was enough to confirm what she already knew. They were afraid. "Do you have anything to add, Mr. Hall?" the council leader asked, turning to the patriarch. William stood slowly, his movements deliberate. He adjusted his suit, his gaze sweeping across the room before settling on Clara. "These are old accusations," he said, his voice measured. "My family's legacy is built on the sacrifices of many, not the accusations of one man who couldn't follow orders." Clara stood abruptly, her anger flaring. "Those weren't just orders. They were a death sentence for innocent people, and your family covered it up to protect themselves." The murmurs in the room grew louder, and the council leader banged his gavel for silence. William's composure slipped for a moment, his expression hardening. "You have no proof of these so-called cover-ups," he snapped. "Just the ramblings of a dead man." "I have his words, his actions, and the people he saved," Clara shot back. "Ask the descendants of those civilians if James Marlowe was a traitor. Ask them who they owe their lives to." The room fell silent again, the weight of her words settling over the council. For a moment, no one spoke. Then one of the council members stood. "I remember hearing about this battle from my grandfather," the man said, his voice quiet but steady. "He always said there was a soldier who saved their village. He didn't know the man's name, but he called him a hero." Another council member nodded, murmuring agreement. The tide in the room was shifting, the truth slowly breaking through the years of lies and manipulation. William Hall's face turned pale, his composure cracking. "This is slander," he barked, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. The council leader raised his hand. "Enough," he said firmly. He turned to Clara. "You've presented compelling evidence, Miss Marlowe. The council will deliberate on this matter." Clara sat back down, her hands trembling slightly. The Hall family left the chamber without another word, their faces etched with barely concealed anger. She exhaled deeply, the weight of the confrontation settling over her. Grayson leaned over, his voice low. "You did well, Clara, but this isn't over yet." She nodded, her eyes fixed on the journal in front of her. The glow of James's grave had been a call to action, and now she could feel its weight in every word she had spoken. The truth was out there now, but she knew the fight wasn't finished. Not yet. The night was still as Clara stood once again in the cemetery, the glow of James Marlowe's grave illuminating the surrounding headstones with its soft, golden light. She felt both victorious and weary. The council's deliberation earlier had shifted the narrative, but she knew the Hall family wouldn't let the truth emerge without a fight. Yet here, in the quiet presence of the grave, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known before. She knelt by the gravestone, placing the locket and a fresh bouquet of wildflowers at its base. The glow seemed to brighten momentarily, as if in acknowledgement. Clara reached into her bag and pulled out the journal, her fingers tracing the worn leather cover. She whispered softly, as if speaking to James himself. "They're going to know what you did," she said. "The lies won't last forever." The sound of footsteps on gravel made her turn sharply. Mr. Grayson emerged from the shadows carrying a lantern. His face was drawn, but his eyes held a glimmer of pride. "I thought I might find you here," he said, stopping a few feet away. The council reached a decision. Clara stood, her heart pounding. "What did they say?" "They're reinstating James's name," he said, a small smile breaking through his usual seriousness. "His record will be cleared, and they'll officially recognize his actions as heroic." A wave of relief washed over Clara, and for the first time in days she allowed herself to smile. She turned back to the grave, her voice trembling with emotion. "You did it, James," she murmured. "You're finally free." Grayson stepped closer, his expression softening. "You've done something remarkable, Clara. You gave him the justice he deserved, but you also gave this village a chance to confront its own history." She nodded, her gaze fixed on the glowing grave. The warmth of the light seemed to seep into her, filling the cold emptiness she had carried for so long. "It was never just about him," she said. "It's about all of us. The truth is what connects us. It's what gives us a reason to keep going." Grayson placed a hand on her shoulder. "That's a lesson many could stand to learn." The two of them stood in silence for a moment, the only sound the soft rustling of leaves in the night breeze. Clara felt a strange sense of closure, as though a weight she hadn't fully understood was finally lifting. Yet deep down she knew the journey wasn't entirely over. As if to confirm her thoughts, the glow from the grave began to fade. It didn't vanish completely. It lingered, faint and steady, as though James's spirit had found peace but wanted her to know his story wasn't done yet. Clara took a deep breath, the cool night air filling her lungs. "I'll write about him," she said, breaking the silence. "About everything he did and everything I've learned. People need to know." Grayson nodded, his eyes glinting in the lantern light. "And they will. You've made sure of that." Clara knelt one last time, her hand resting on the gravestone. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "For your courage. For everything." As she stood and turned to leave, the faint glow of the grave flickered like a final goodbye. Clara felt a sense of resolve harden within her. The truth had been buried for too long, but now it was free, and so was she. She walked away from the cemetery, her steps lighter than they had been in years, knowing that James's story would live on, and so would his light. Days passed, but Clara couldn't shake the feeling that her journey wasn't over. The council's decision to clear James's name had been a significant victory, but questions still lingered in her mind. What had truly motivated the Hall family to cover up his story? Why had they gone to such lengths to suppress the truth, and why did the grave's glow feel unfinished? She sat at her desk, the journal open before her, its pages a tangle of thoughts, memories, and confessions. James's words were raw and powerful, and she felt the weight of them with every line she read. His final entries spoke of betrayal, not just from his superiors, but from someone closer to him. The words were cryptic, the details vague. But one thing was clear. James had known his fate was sealed long before it happened. Her phone buzzed, breaking her concentration. It was Grayson. "We need to talk," he said, his voice tense. "Something's come up." Within the hour, Clara was back at his house, sitting across from him at the same cluttered table where they had first gone over the journal. Grayson slid a photograph toward her, his expression grave. It was old, the edges frayed, showing a group of soldiers standing in front of a bunker. James was among them, his face solemn, his stance proud. But Clara's eyes were drawn to the man standing beside him, a younger William Hall. "James and William served together?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Grayson nodded. "I've been digging through old records. They were part of the same unit. This was taken a week before the orders that led to the massacre James tried to prevent." Clara's stomach turned as she studied the photograph. The connection between James and the Hall family wasn't just political, it was personal. She flipped the photo over, noticing faint writing on the back. "To James, for Evelyn." Her chest tightened. Evelyn's name again. What did it mean? Grayson leaned forward. "There's more. William Hall didn't just serve with James. He was the one who signed the report labeling him a traitor." Clara felt like the ground had shifted beneath her. "He framed him." Grayson nodded grimly. "And he's been covering it up ever since." The room fell silent as Clara's mind raced. William Hall hadn't just been complicit in burying James's story, he had orchestrated it. He had destroyed a man's name to protect himself, and the glow of the grave was a constant reminder of the truth he had tried to erase. Clara's resolve hardened. "We need to expose him." Grayson sighed. "It won't be easy. The Hall family still has influence, and they'll fight this with everything they have." "I don't care," Clara said firmly. "James deserves justice, and the world deserves the truth." Grayson studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Then let's finish what we started." The next few days were a blur of preparation. Clara and Grayson pieced together every shred of evidence they had, connecting the dots between James's journal, the letters, and the photograph. They uncovered testimonies from descendants of the civilians James had saved, each one painting a clearer picture of his heroism and the betrayal that had followed. When they were ready, Clara published the full story online. She shared James's journal, the photograph, and the letters, weaving them together into a powerful narrative that demanded to be heard. The response was immediate. Social media erupted with outrage. News outlets picked up the story, and the Hall family found themselves at the center of a storm they couldn't control. William Hall held a press conference, his face pale and drawn. He denied the accusations, but his words rang hollow. The evidence was too strong, the truth too loud to silence anymore. Clara watched the broadcast from her living room, her heart pounding as the cracks in his facade grew deeper with every question he faced. That night she returned to the cemetery. The graveyard was quiet, the air cool and still. James's grave glowed softly, its light steady and warm. Clara knelt beside it, her hand resting on the stone. "It's done," she whispered. "They know the truth now." The glow seemed to pulse gently, like a heartbeat slowing after a long race. For the first time, Clara felt a sense of true peace. James's story was no longer hidden, and his name would be remembered for what it was, a symbol of courage, sacrifice, and integrity. As she stood to leave, the glow began to fade. She watched as the light dimmed, leaving only the gravestone and the quiet presence of the night. It was as though James was finally at rest, his soul no longer bound by the lies that had tarnished his memory. Clara smiled faintly, her heart lighter than it had been in years. She walked away from the graveyard, knowing that while James's light had faded, his story would burn bright in the hearts of those who heard it. His truth had shattered the silence, and his legacy would live on. Weeks passed, and the ripples of James Marlowe's story continued to spread. Clara watched as articles, documentaries, and public discussions brought his heroism into the spotlight. People shared stories of their own forgotten family members, inspired by James's courage and sacrifice. The Hall family's power had weakened. Their name was now tied to shame and deception rather than prestige. For Clara, it felt like justice, but she knew this journey had changed her in ways she was only beginning to understand. She sat in her small study, surrounded by notes, photographs, and old documents. The journal rested on her desk, open to the first page, James's name scrawled in hurried handwriting. A fresh sheet of paper lay beside it, marked with her own words, "The Light Beneath the Grave, the True Story of James Marlowe." Her hands trembled slightly as she wrote the opening lines, the weight of the story still heavy, but this time it carried purpose rather than burden. As she worked, her phone buzzed with a notification. She glanced at the screen. A message from Grayson. "Turn on the news. Something you'll want to see." Her heart quickened as she grabbed the remote and switched on the television. The screen filled with an image of the graveyard, a group of people gathered around James's grave. A ceremony was taking place, the village honoring him with a new memorial, a bronze plaque that bore his name and the words, "A hero remembered, a legacy restored." Clara leaned back in her chair, a lump forming in her throat as she watched. The camera panned over the crowd, capturing faces young and old, some holding flowers, others holding candles. It was a collective moment of remembrance and healing, one that James's story had made possible. Later that evening, Clara returned to the graveyard. The ceremony was over, but a few candles remained, their flames flickering gently in the cool night air. She approached the grave, her footsteps soft on the grass. The new plaque gleamed in the moonlight, its inscription a reminder of what had been achieved. She knelt down, her hand brushing the edge of the stone. "I think we did it, James," she said softly. "Your story isn't buried anymore." The night was quiet, but Clara felt a presence, a warmth that seemed to wrap around her like an embrace. The grave no longer glowed, but it didn't feel empty. It felt peaceful. James had found his rest, and so had Clara. As she stood and turned to leave, she noticed something she hadn't before. At the base of the stone, faintly etched into the mossy ground, were two words, "Thank you." Her breath caught and a tear slipped down her cheek. She didn't know if it was real, a trick of the light, or her imagination, but it didn't matter. She smiled, her heart full, and walked away, the stars above her shining just a little brighter. James Marlowe's story was no longer a secret. It was a beacon, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, The truth would always find its way into the light.
Subscribe and press the bell icon so that you never miss the amazing video.